So despite the drawbacks to blockchain, there's still a lot of financial institutions and a lot of other businesses that use it. And that's because they calculate the cost of power and they look to see whether or not it's profitable for them with regards to other things. But when you really look at blockchain, just think of industries that had middlemen and how they can be changed. For example, what about Uber and Airbnb? What if the people who want to do it just add themselves to the block and all talk to each other? Why do you need to pay that money to Uber when you could just do it directly to each other? Right now, a big area is smart contracts. This is the big focus. Why? Because when you want to do contracts, like ship things from overseas or something like that, you have to fill out a lot of paperwork and you have to wait for approval and things like that. Well, once again, the big advantage of blockchain is that it adds a legitimacy to what you're doing. And so smart contracts is a big area where you could save a lot of time and money. Real estate is another area, for that matter, used goods. Why not just get rid of the eBays, or actually more specifically the Alibabas, and save money that way. In terms of cybersecurity, actually a lot of you probably know more about this area than I do. But when we look at the malware that could possibly hit us, the thing for IT people is when you own all this infrastructure, you have to be concerned about firewalls and event managers and things like that. And so the question is if your system were perfectly internally contained, then you would never get a virus. So it's coming from the outside. And so the things that people do are like file sharing or email. That's the way it's brought in. And so one approach to solving this is basically get rid of your IT network altogether. It takes a lot of resources to own IT, and then the question is, how much added value do you really get out of it? And we'll talk about that in a little bit. But the other issue is that people can be very well-meaning, but they make mistakes. And so the big one was in the military, that in the Middle East, someone found a thumb drive, plugged it into the computer, and introduced a worm. And it took 14 months to clean that worm out. And so one suggestion is to move everything to the cloud. The thing about the cloud is it's not direct, your data and everything else is not directly hooked necessarily to the interface that you're using. And so each request has to be authenticated. And so that way, in effect, you only have one conduit in. And so, because it only accepts service requests, there's a layer of security that you have because you're not directly tied to everything else, whereas your own internal systems are. Can cybersecurity, though, be a moneymaker for you? And that's that people now are very afraid of the internet and everything else. I had one person who wouldn't open my attachment on an email because they thought it was a virus because they hadn't heard from me forever. But people will be willing to pay more for quality systems. The other thing is there's more, it's worthwhile for corporations to invest more into security because it's like insurance. You either pay a little now or more later. And Cisco is estimated that the value of everybody's IT is about $5.3 trillion. So there's definitely value there. Silicon technology, the way a semiconductor works, and it is well named, it's a semiconductor, meaning sometimes it'll flow electrons and current and sometimes it won't. And so naturally when it's flowing information, that's a digital state of a 1, and when it's not flowing anything, it's a 0. And the way it works is, if you remember your basic chemistry, silicon has 4 electrons on its outer shell. And so if I pair it with the second electron, I get a bond. And so silicon forms an isometric system. So where are these carriers coming from if you have these strong bonds? Well, what you do is introduce another atom, which is called a dopant. And so like phosphorus, for example, has 5 electrons on its shell. So it forms a bond, but has an extra electron. So when I put a voltage across it, that electron becomes freed up and starts to conduct. The semiconductor is the foundation of our age. when you look at the cloud and everything else, all of it is dependent on something else. And what it all sits on top of is a semiconductor, that they become faster, they become cheaper, they become denser. You can have more electrons and greater functionality. But the thing to keep in mind is that we still live in a world where that doesn't run on micro power, it's macro. And so your infrastructure matters, and the limit is semiconductors. It's the foundation which everything sits on. And so Gordon Moore, one of the co-founders of Intel, came up with a theory saying that the number of devices in silicon will double every 2 years. And his theories held on a lot longer than anybody ever thought. The problem is that 11 nanometers, the physics of silicon start to break down. We are not at 10 yet, and so we've already slowed down from it. But the basic idea of a transistor is that you have a source of electrons called the source, and there's a place it goes to called the drain. And so when they talk about 22 nanometer technology, what they're really talking about is what that gate length is, how far those electrons have to travel. The problem is when it gets too small, then all of a sudden, now it's not very hard for the electrons to cross that. And that's called leakage. And so all of a sudden your zeros start becoming ones. Not only that, these facilities are getting really, really expensive. And so there are just so many companies that can afford to build a $5 or $10 billion facility. And a lot of people say, no, we're going to stay at 22. We have no problems with that. To keep this in perspective, 22 nanometers means 220 angstroms. An atom is typically like 20 to 30 angstroms across. So you're talking about a distance of 10 atoms. The bottleneck in all this is basically all the technology that goes into semiconductors. How do you make things really all that small? And not only that, but you have to get the signal off chip somehow. And so all of a sudden now you're so little. How do you drive those big loads? And so they're trying to come up with alternative technologies. One is graphene, which is basically carbon atoms, and carbon and silicon are in the same family. They both have 4 electrons on the outside. The problem is it's really fast high mobility. The problem is that they're hard to switch off. Quantum tunneling requires, and a lot of you have probably heard about quantum computing. The idea behind quantum computing is that in the quanta scale, you can have multiple states. Instead of having 0 and 1, you can have like 8 states. So imagine every bit being 8 states as opposed to 2 states. And so, now of course this means you have to rewrite all your machine language and software and everything else. But the drawback to this approach, and they haven't really built a good quantum computer yet, is that it requires exotic materials. And those exotic materials are very expensive, and there may not be enough of them. If you remember a while back, they were talking about how everything's going to become magnetic levitation because they found something using rare earth materials. One little problem, they're called rare earth materials, meaning lanthanum and things like that. There's not enough on the planet, so what are we going to do? Go build rockets, go fly to Mars and mine it and bring it back? But the speeds will continue to improve, and that's that designers through systems design will continue to make them better. And to put that in perspective, your battery systems, all of a sudden cell phones, 10, 20 years ago, you only got 3 to 5 hours of charge, and now you've got a day. How did it go up so much? Well, it went up so much for the simple reason that they did smart power. They shut all the systems down and only use power when they need to use it. And they started making parts that consumed low power. And so the thing that's a little scary now about device technology is there's nothing on the horizon. Silicon took 30 years to make it. OLED, those nice bright displays you have right now, took 25 years to make it. So anyway, The strategic implication of all these super technologies is that eventually some industries and technology die all the time. Here's something to think about in terms of strategy. Are we seeing the end of economies of scale? Meaning the conventional thought always is if I make a lot of stuff, that's a competitive advantage because I pay less per every new piece I make. But what that was based on is fixed costs. That to make low volumes, I have very high fixed costs, and so I can't get there. Well, fixed costs are coming down because you can rent so many things, and so you don't have those issues about building up infrastructure anymore. So economies of scale are becoming less of an issue in a lot of industries. And here's a little quiz question for you. What is the market share of Airbnb and sharing lodging businesses? Is it 0.5%, 1%, or 5%? Right now I think I should be playing the Jeopardy music. Anyway, the answer is 1.5%. Despite everybody saying, oh my god, everything's going to go to Airbnb, they've taken a significant share. I mean, considering how big that this, we're talking about a market that's hundreds of billions of dollars. Excuse me. I'm still fighting the terminal cold. 1.5% is pretty significant. But what it really kind of comes down to is there are advantages to hotels. You can't overlook it. And that's that they're strategically placed. Like the house may not be by the beach, but you know your hotel is going to be on the beach. Not only that, I like hotels better because I just like to be pampered. I like my sheets changed every day. I like the mint on the pillow. But anyway, that's something else to look at when you look at the strategic implications of technology.